So, welcome everybody. I know we've been doing these lectures, our Fridays at 1, which became the Fridays at 1:30. We've been doing it for a couple of years now, but this particular year, we decided that we were going to ramp that one up a little bit. And with the help of David Hill, who graduated from our program back in 1984, before he then went on to Harvard and got his master's there, and then came back after practicing a while in other places, came back to work in Southwest Virginia as his contribution to the development of the landscape of Southwest Virginia. David and I were talking about what we could do to celebrate the fact that in June 2024 is the 50th anniversary of the first graduates of the landscape architecture program at Virginia Tech. It was on the quarter system back then, which is why it was a June graduation. And so what we thought is, rather than having a one-time event, we do a lot. And so on Friday night next week, we're doing a kickoff reception over in the stadium. We can't do it tonight because it's homecoming this weekend. So it's next weekend. And that's really to kind of celebrate where we've been, but also to bring people back. And then we thought that another way to bring people back that would actually be much more helpful to students and also to collecting information about our graduates is to have a lecture series, which is David very smartly, I think, calls the L series, because anytime that you're working on a construction set, the L's drawings are those that are done by the landscape architects, but L also for landscape, and it's also a series. So it all just kind of fit right in here. And we thought we would do this topically. So we're doing 10 of these this year. So there'll be somewhere between 30 and 40 alumni, all alumni, that are coming in to talk about their work on the topic that they're coming in and associated with other panelists on. And that's what we're going to be learning a little bit about is the impact of their work, but also their legacy as landscape architects. So we want to celebrate our alumni at the same time that we're elevating landscape architecture and then providing all of you as students and new faculty opportunities to kind of see what else is out there and different ways of thinking about things, so that you'll have some face recognition with a lot of alumni that are practicing in different ways, and some contacts. So perhaps you go visit them in their own offices or get internships or whatever, look at projects that they've done in real time in real places. So the idea here is that each of the panels has a host, in this case, a hostess, and that we hand all of the responsibilities for introductions and framing the panel onto our host. They knew that ahead of time, and they still said yes.
I did.
So, Seema Laguerre.
Alrighty. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for an interesting conversation regarding neighborhood and community planning. Today's conversation will be From Concept to Reality, the Vital Role of Neighborhood Planning in Sustainability. The presentation will run as follows. Each panelist, myself, and the two gentlemen to my right, will introduce ourselves. We will provide work examples, and then we will dive into an in-depth conversation regarding neighborhood and community planning from all three different perspectives and practice focuses. Today, we have myself, Seema Laguerre, coming from Kinley Horn in the Orlando office. I serve as the moderator for today's conversation. And to my right, I have Sean Tooley from Land Design, and I have Stephen Talley from BHP. Each of us will present a selection of images that will display our work as it relates to this topic for everyone to get a better understanding as to who we are and why we are engaging in this conversation. We hope that today everyone can walk away with information, recommendations, and emerging trends we see being discussed within our practice realms. So again, these are our three beautiful faces. I'm the moderator. I come from Kinley Horn in Orlando. Some of you might know Haley Harnett. Haley, can you? Yeah. She interned with us last summer, and I'm now her supervisor. So this is fun for her. We also have Sean Tooley from Land Design and Stephen Talley from BHP. All right. Where's he at? I messed up. I don't know how to use a Mac. I'm a PC person. So I apologize. Okay. So I guess I'm going first. As stated before, my name is Seema Laguerre, and I currently work for Kinley Horn in Orlando, where I focus my practice on community and neighborhood planning. through the public and private developments. I previously worked for NAC Design Strategies, where I obtained valuable knowledge that was transcribed and has helped me in my current practice. As you can see, I'm not that tech savvy with a Mac. So Meridian Parks. This is a project of mine that I actually started at NAC and has currently followed me to Kenley Horn. This project is a large-scale community and neighborhood master plan focused on sustainability, connection, green spaces, and green corridors. The project is currently in construction for 4 to 5 phases, with phases 1 through 3 being completed earlier this year, and the design continues daily for all others. The following 5 slides that I will show will pertain to Meridian Parks. So this rendering here is a rendering that we completed back in 2019. I was with NAC Design Strategies, and this was done by myself and a few of our other designers up in Toronto. Some of the questions that we ask are, how can the vision of the master plan become a reality? We focus on the detailed design, specific goals and direction, and we continue to evaluate the process as we go along. What does the master plan look like, and how can we begin to develop and phase the overall development? Where are parks and open spaces located? Where will it connect trails? How do we deal with stormwater? What is the end project? What type of movement should be incorporated in the community? Trails, trailheads, bike paths? These are all the types of questions that we ask when we are developing community plans. What are the amenities in the community, and how many will be present? Where and what are the open spaces? Do we provide neighborhood parks? Do we allow for existing vegetation and wetlands to be incorporated? These are all the questions that we ask in the beginning, middle, and end of the process. And then we get to specific elements. Once we figure out the plan, how do we develop those important open spaces? What is the theme, and how is it incorporated into those spaces? Do we develop our public-private partnerships to keep us to get to the finish line, or do we actually look at it from a specific development? What is the end goal, and how do we make it a reality? So that was the first project that I had back at NAC, and this is another project that is called Celebration Island Village. This is a project of mine that was a very hard and specific project. It was focused on developing a new neighborhood within an existing and well-established community that was run and controlled by Disney. Questions that we asked were, what principles are important from Disney that we should incorporate and be applied into this community? The following 6 slides will pertain to celebration. So with this one, we asked public spaces. Should they be inclusive, create play, focus internally, and ultimately, are they there to provide community? In this space, we look at the scale of the open space. Can it define what takes place there? Don't overprogram. Allow for amenities in certain locations and for the community to decide what happens there. How does the community evolve? Are those numerous types of developments utilized? Is it mixed use, single family, commercial? Doing so can create central hubs for interaction throughout your development. Do you engage the ecosystem? Build on the natural opportunities that are present, or do you create opportunities for sustainability on your own? Do you provide for interactions at all scales of the natural features that are present? Do we create focal points within the community for gathering, diversify the scales of interaction and allow for inclusivity? Or do we just generally cultivate community and people will follow? So in general, when designing for community and neighborhoods, use the resources present to generate designs for sustainability. Provide opportunities for learning and engagement, and ask how can sustainability evolve over the time of your neighborhood? Do you provide education through design and planning? Do we understand that sustainability can be taught at various scales? And can it be incorporated throughout the entire community thoughtfully? What about fostering engagement at the beginning, middle, and end of the project? Residential buy-in is key. The concept can become the reality through each of these methods. Lastly, we understand that community and neighborhood planning can be designed for the public versus the typical private residential developments. Within these projects, public engagement is necessary and is mandatory. Next up, I believe we have Sean.
Hi, I'm Sean Tooley. I'm with Land Design, graduated in 2002. So I think when Chima introduced kind of their slides, I think it's important to talk about design process as it relates to master plan communities. Within Land Design, master plan communities is a large passion of ours and something that we really embrace. And so this graphic we actually show in a lot of presentations shows kind of the gear shifts of how we explore how we start design, because I think as students, a lot of people get stuck on their first line. And so how does something get started? And then what happens when you get to the third one, you have to go back to the first. So like the gear idea, I think it's important to show how that flows and how going back to the first step doesn't mean you're going backwards. It's just you're revisiting certain things. And so, whether it's opportunities, discovery, visioning, the magic, as we like to call it, the big idea, what's that epiphany you have with the project? And then lastly, the story, Chima certainly spoke to as well. So the first project I'll talk about is Willisford, up in Northern Virginia in Loudoun County. When you're talking about master plan communities or community development, a lot of what the first preconceived notion is that it's a larger scale, right? You have a lot of greenfield, you're controlling all of the variables. The real goal there is to address, solve problems of infrastructure. So when you talk about infrastructure, you're talking about roads, blocks, open space and amenity program, architecture, and then theming and branding. All of that goes into a community, or at least what you're trying to create in a greenfield type development. So we talk about natural systems and how to embrace nature. And so Willisford embraced trails. Obviously, all those are very important. It's very typical, but the way that we did that was very different in that it was integrated with other natural systems for the neighborhood, which we could really kind of leverage and create value, because that's really what it's all about when you're talking these scales. The other one is theming and branding. And we don't talk a lot about that in school, but how do you communicate that idea? And once you have a great drawing or set of drawings, you have that idea in your head, how you express that and how that then becomes part of the package. Theming and branding is certainly a big part of community development, how you express your theme of how you're differentiating. And then this is the River District in Charlotte, which is a 2,500 acre project, which is its own town, right? It's right next to the airport in Charlotte. And how do you create themes in this neighborhood that then contribute and create your own community? Again, I think the great thing about this scale greenfield development is that you're controlling most of the variables. So you're able to orchestrate certain things and expression from design. And the more you can control that or leverage that, the easier that story is to tell. So now I'll bring it down into a different scale. And I think when we talk about community planning, how that transitions from greenfield into an urban core. So this is the second of the third context that I'll talk about. So this is what I would characterize as urban. This is Commonwealth, which is in the Plaza Midwood area of Charlotte. And so in the urban scale, you really have several blocks that you're dealing with, but you can still create community by offering open space, street networks, activated streetscapes. All of that is very important. You'll notice in this, the volumes that we address from rooftops, the architectural edge, streetscape, and then urban plazas. The two buildings in the middle are actually adaptive reuse. They're old mill buildings. It's a coal manufacturing facility from the early 1900s. So just a really cool way to reposition that. And that brings a notion of community to this project. This is the rooftop of the office building, kind of looking directly at Charlotte. But again, how do you instill community while bringing market value to this? And so the people that work in this project will be a part of the community. So in essence, this is a very walkable area. Plaza Midwood in Charlotte is very walkable kind of context already. So how do you build on that? The last scale that I'll talk about is transit oriented. So it's urban, but it's instead of addressing multiple blocks, you're really talking about one block. So this is the design district in South End Charlotte. An emphasis here is how do you, from a community perspective, embrace the idea of a third place. When people's parents come to Charlotte, where do you take them? So it's places like this that kind of celebrate community. And so this is really a celebratory space in terms of the urban plaza definition of it. It's location next to light rail. So you have a rail trail, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this is really a celebration of community, how each project then contributes to a larger picture that's a lot different in scale than Greenfield. Go to the next one. I'm sure a lot of people have seen the image of the Heart Wall in Charlotte. So that's right around the corner. So you have jewel box, retail opportunities, paseos, promenades, all that link to streets, to residential, and then to the rail trail, which is very important. And the sequence of that is really orchestrated in a way to embrace community and create community benefit. And then this is Atherton, so you'll see this is next door to the design district. And so this is the rail trail that connects the entire spine of the light rail in South Charlotte. And the way it was created is actually amazing. It was originally intended to be fire access. It was just going to be a sidewalk that goes between the street and the back of the building right next to the light rail. So you have a double facade really. And people started painting it and activating it, chairs and tables. Now it's more widely used in the streets. So again, you're finding community spaces that you otherwise wouldn't have planned for. And it's related to infrastructure, which is a great value add. Again, just another kind of view of that, of how this was intended to be the back of house when all of the plans were done for the light rail for South Charlotte. And you'll see how it's being activated. It's not at all the back of house, very much front door. That's where people want to be and be seen. And then just one last image of the design district. It's celebratory of that scale.
Thanks, Sean. I'm Stephen Talley. I'm a landscape architect with VHB. And I'll just give you a brief kind of overview of VHB. We're a multidisciplinary planning, design, engineering firm. And we're really committed to three values here: improving mobility, enhancing communities, and balancing development and infrastructure needs with environmental stewardship. But really what that means is, and what we're committed to, is connecting people to place to really create community. So if you go to the next slide. And this is sort of the culture at VHB. This is what we do kind of every day with each other, as well as with the projects that we work on. So I'm going to run through a few projects and just illustrate how the projects we work on connect people, because that's really, I think, a strong theme with the work that I do. This is a project in Washington, D.C. It's connecting the Crystal City to the Reagan Airport. And it's a bridge that goes over the George Washington Memorial Parkway. A lot of thought went into this project in terms of the design of the bridge, how it connects people from Crystal City to DCA, and really how it's more than just a bridge. It's a place that we're creating, and it's connecting two places. We go to the next slide. This is a project that's actually in just south of downtown Boston, underneath of I-93. And this was an old parking lot, essentially underneath the interstate. And really the goal here was to activate that space, and in return, it influenced all the real estate around I-93 in that particular district. This is just there's a multi-use trail that connects with the park underneath the interstate, basketball courts, all those kinds of things. There's also a canal to the right of the image there. That's what the people are sitting in those chairs. So it's really, again, activating that area, creating a place for people to gather and really create community in an urban setting and in an area where you typically wouldn't gather, underneath an interstate. So that was a kind of a really cool, interesting project. And I think it sets a precedent for other ways to activate spaces. Something else that we really try to focus on in our work is creating experiences for people that they may have otherwise not had. Access to the waterfront is a big one. We're an East Coast firm that I work with. Most of the projects I work on have some sort of waterfront component. This was in Boynton Beach, Florida. And this was really about connecting people to that harbor. It was a little pocket park, essentially, that we designed. But really, it's about, again, creating those experiences and providing those opportunities for people to connect. This is a really cool project in Richmond. And I put that word inspire down there because that's really the antithesis of this project. This was the Maggie Walker Memorial Plaza in Richmond. And it's right at the sort of threshold to the Jackson Ward, which is a historically African-American community. And Maggie Walker was a well-renowned businesswoman, Black businesswoman in Richmond. And really, we want to honor her legacy that she created in Richmond with this plaza. So the design, working with the sculptor, was really to radiate her positive energy and attitude on the Jackson Ward. And that sort of reflected in the concentric circles there, and a lot of the messaging you see in the text and those kinds of things. But aside from the actual design, it was also, the next slide will show that really this is about creating place for people to gather and connect once again, and really create community and have a feeling of, a sense of ownership of the community. This is a park in Short Pump, which is also in Richmond, a suburban area of Richmond, which, suburban areas I feel like are known for there's never any good place to gather, engage with other folks other than, Walmart or something. So this park was really intended to create that opportunity for people once again to come together and really create community in that suburban area of Richmond. As I mentioned earlier, most of the projects, or a lot of the projects I work on, are on the waterfront. And this is and I wouldn't even call it emerging trend. It's emerged at this point, but adapting to how we use the waterfront and how the waterfronts are developed. This was the Yorktown waterfront. In the late 90s, actually, was when this photo was taken. And the next photo will show how that waterfront has been improved. This was a Yorktown Riverwalk. I didn't specifically work on this project, but my company did. And the message here is that there's an entire market of these sort of resiliency projects that we can revive waterfront areas, using those kinds of projects. If you go to the next project, this was just the improvement of the living shoreline, but what it really did was revive the community. No one was going down there to the Yorktown waterfront. It was, it was constantly flooded. It was, deteriorated. And through that work of that project, we really created a community space that turned into a place and now has totally revived. And they've had to move, their concert series from Saturday to Wednesday nights because it's so crowded. It's really revived that community. So I think that might be it. Yeah.
Alrighty. So now we're going to dive into a more in-depth conversation about the overall topic. So our first question is, what is neighborhood and community planning? We have two definitions up here. One is specifically for neighborhood planning and the other one's for community planning. And I'll just open it up to panelists. Like, do you guys agree with both of these definitions of what neighborhood and community planning are? Or do you think that there are some things that are missing from these definitions that might not be included in these?
I think this makes sense. And I think all of our slides kind of showed to a certain degree of how community is found in places that otherwise nothing would be there. And I think that ability to create value contributes to community planning. But
yeah, I think that community-led approach that's used in that first definition really could be used in the second one as well. I think in the case of greenfield development, where you're sort of developing a neighborhood from nothing, maybe that's not as prevalent, but specifically in like urban revitalization, that's key, is having those community members there, taking ownership of their community and being a part of that process, again, to the process.
Yeah. And I think one thing that I've noticed when you think through community planning, so my company is primarily private. A lot of the work that we do is private. We do public work, and we, greenways and trails and public parks and things like that, where there is a community process that community-led or community-involved approach is critical. However, a lot of our projects, there isn't that component. And in order to engage that conversation, sometimes can be slow and kind of be careful what you ask for. You're never going to make everybody happy. So you kind of have to go about it with your own expertise. And so I'm just pointing out that there are examples where it's not a public process, but that we have to help find community in every project that we do, really. And you don't have the luxury of having a community engagement portion of every project. But, when you're going through critiques with your clients, other stakeholders, municipalities, the community is at the core of a lot of that. So I just want to kind of point that out.
That's important. And I think our expertise as landscape architects in those kind of developments is we can create those opportunities for a community to take shape. There may not be a community now, but we're building housing or retail or whatever it is. We want, those places need to have community, as a part of them. So as landscape architects, providing those spaces to connect and the opportunity. That's really key. Yeah.
I would piggyback off of that, and I would say that a question that I often ask whenever I'm doing a community planning project or even just like a neighborhood specific project is, how is my design going to morph the community that I'm creating, but how will it also change the surrounding neighborhoods? So similar to how they both have projects, and myself included, that we came into a project that it was maybe needing revitalization, and how does our design change then that space, but then how does that change everything surrounding it? So community is not just about that one location that you are designing. It's about how does that design then transcribe everything else surrounding it. So it's really, you have to be intentional and also very responsive to what you're doing in that space, not just thinking about how that's going to impact people there, but how do the people who used to go to that space or now want to come to that space, how do they feel included and invited into that community? So I think that that's where neighborhood and community planning kind of coalescing and kind of come together, is that neighborhood is what is created. The community is the overall broader, larger scale. How do both of those come together? So have any of you guys worked on projects that are dealing with engagement or community planning, where you are having to interact with residents and you're trying to figure out how do you create a design to help those people, but have you thought about what that design would then feel for the others? So has anyone dealt with this now, or has anyone seen your project about neighborhood and community planning?
So I did for my senior project, we did design in Wilmington, Delaware. We were connecting a downtown space to I believe a residential district. We talked to a lot of community members. We sat in with a lot of like the board meetings. I believe the organization was called Building Back Better Wilmington or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head. It was a while ago, but I've dealt with a project like that. It was really important to hear what the community's feedback is, because you might not necessarily know it just off the top of your head.
And it's also like, you as a designer, you have a certain thought of what you might think the community needs, but then they'll tell you that complete opposite, and then you have to pivot and shift. So what would you say is the one thing that you learned from experiencing that kind of community engagement?
One thing I learned is like we often look through a lens of design and not through a lens of somebody that's not necessarily not familiar, but like somebody is not actively looking through that lens. So I think the most important thing is like talking to people, just as a general thing, talking to people that aren't necessarily involved in the field of design or architecture is really important to like contributing to your design as a whole.
Yeah, I would say that probably something that we learned was that we were taught how to speak, how a designer speaks. When you go to these community engagement meetings, what is juxtaposition? What is essence? Like, what is that? So it's like when you're dealing with community and neighborhood planning, just remember how you speak in school and how you speak in your profession is not how that's necessarily going to apply when you go to these different events.
You got to connect with your audience.
Yes.
They're not understanding all of that. You're going to lose them.
Yeah. Was there anybody else who had that experience?
Click.
Nope.
As they're doing the IT thing, there's a whole third-year class that's doing it.
No. Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, there it is. All right. So now that we kind of understand what is neighborhood and community planning, some of the benefits of neighborhood and community planning, we kind of outlined some of these. These are just things that we understand come with neighborhood and community planning. I know for myself, enhanced quality of life is number one. Sustainable development is number two for me, really. And then we really focus on economic prosperity. But out of this list, what do you guys think, based on like your experience? What are those benefits that you've seen when you do community and neighborhood planning?
One comment I'll make: economic prosperity really can be tied to several of these. Some of the economic development, directors that I've worked with in the past, quality of life projects is what they'll call it. But they're really striving to build projects that increase quality of life because it brings people to their town or to their city or whatever it may be. So when we think about sustainability in that social, economic, environmental lens, economic is actually more related than it sounds on paper. Through things like quality of life.
Yeah, and I think to that same point, a lot of the places that we're going to create and help envision are intuitively going to expand to a larger scale. So there are projects, a lot of the projects that we actually work on will start out as a shopping center or a town center or a neighborhood. And it seems to make such a splash that like everything around it starts to brand itself and include that, right? So there's areas of Charlotte where, a neighborhood will come in and then all of a sudden everything around it is that name town center, that name, whatever. And so people start to embrace that. And so I think that's community, incorporating that and just buying into those ideas and changing who they are in a good way, just helping it evolve. So I think the evolution of community is something that we think about as we go through each of these areas. Just how things evolve are very interesting and should be thought about at the early stages.
I think another thing that we could look at as like a benefit is like accessibility is definitely a big thing when we're thinking about neighborhood and community planning. And I look at accessibility as incorporating universal design principles. So that's something that I don't know if you guys are learning that at this point in school, but that's something that kind of take with you when you graduate is universal design is very important. And not just looking at like ADA compliance, but people with disabilities. Like I'm assuming you all maybe have gone in the wheelchair around campus yet, or maybe you haven't. Has anybody gone in a wheelchair around campus in class yet? No. One person.
Yeah.
How accessible is Virginia Tech?
It wasn't at that moment.
Okay.
A couple years back.
Yeah. So I think there was a class that I had back.
I had it too.
I think all of us have had that class where we realized that universal design and ADA and accessibility are things that we might not necessarily think about because we may be able-bodied people, but that's something that when you are thinking about neighborhood and community planning, you can't just think about who, like you're designing for yourself. You have to think about people that you might not even consider. Someone that maybe they broke their leg, now they have to use crutches. Well, maybe you should probably have a ramp instead of just, staircases, or maybe you shouldn't terrace this one part of your community. So it's thinking about how do you design for everyone and not just a certain portion, as well as one thing that I think is a benefit of neighborhood community planning is, especially in Florida, affordable housing. You guys are not probably dealing with that right now, but in our profession,
everywhere.
it's big
Not just Florida.
everywhere. It's big everywhere. Like, how do people live and thrive in the space where we now create these amazing centers? We now create these amazing nodes, but now because we've done this, economic prosperity happens. But then affordable housing is no longer possible. So how do we tie those two together? That could be a benefit and also a deficit of community neighborhood planning. But we just have to work through that and we have to plan for that ahead of time. So those are things that you guys can think about as well. Think about the things that may not affect you right now, but what can affect you in 5 to 10 years from now. Anything else you guys want to?
That's a great point.
Cool. Okay, so what are the fundamental principles that underpin successful neighborhood planning? I've identified 5 here. These are just kind of 5 that I believe based on practices that we've done and just kind of what we see in the current climate, that these are things that we know are the 5 principles that we absolutely need when we are doing neighborhood planning. Do you guys agree, disagree? Is there anything that should be added to the list, taken off?
I think just the one thing I would add is under clear vision and goals, we spoke about it before, is our ability as designers to communicate those ideas. Because if you get to a point of a design and you're not effectively communicating it, it's not going to resonate with your client. And those ideas may die on the vine unless you can point out how that adds value to make the deal pencil. I think it's worth reminding everyone that this is a business. And so our job is to create economic value while also addressing all of these things. So the better we can communicate that, I think the more important all of these things would be, and the more success we'll see in creating great communities.
Yeah. I think these points sort of speak to the importance of that master plan too, like a master community plan. There could be a park that, needs some work. And if you go in and put new sidewalks in and, make it accessible, that you didn't necessarily solve the problem, because thinking about that bigger picture is really key.
Yeah, I would say, how many times do you guys, I guess I'll pose this to the group, like before you start a project, if your professors are giving you a project, like how long do you actually take to set out objectives and a clear vision for that project? Like typically, how long do you normally take? Because I know in our practice now, if it's like a huge project, we may take a couple days, couple hours to really figure out what that vision is, and it might evolve. But are you guys doing that in your projects now? Or are you just diving in to what the objective statement that you were given was? Or are you actually sitting in it and thinking about what is the vision that I want to create for this project?
I think sometimes, like me personally, I try to figure out my own goals and objectives, but if I can't figure them out right away, I find that sometimes I get them later on, and then I can kind of like circle back.
That's what I wanted to hear. Yes, that sometimes happens, where it's like you have a vision at the beginning, and then you start working on that, and then all of a sudden you start designing and you're developing things, and then you're developing something, and then all of a sudden, let's say a year down the line, something comes up that no one saw, no one knew, and now you're like, oh boy, what we had now has to shift to this. So that's something that I've experienced. Have you guys experienced where like you did a project, you had that clear vision, you knew exactly what you were doing, and then a wrench was thrown and you're like, oh, now we got to pivot.
That's one of the hardest challenges of our profession. I'm totally with you, where before I start doing anything, I just start drawing. Nothing's going to come out of my brain that is useful until I start drawing. And so you start drawing and kind of creating ideas, and then you understand what to leverage and what's starting to emerge. But yeah, that you get down the path, and then something gets questioned, and your whole concept kind of falls apart. You got to go back to the beginning, and it's really hard to divorce yourself from that idea and start over. Now that you kind of have all the history and muscle memory is taking you in that direction.
Yeah, the Crystal City to DCA bridge that I showed as a prime example, we did that project, and then Amazon announced they were going to do their second headquarters or whatever.
That's a wrinkle.
Up there. So we're like, does this even work anymore? So we are back at the drawing board now, currently with another project, thinking about more holistically. Crystal City.
A funny story, similar. I was working on terminal is like a plaza area in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and part of it was a parking lot design. We weaved in and out of big trees, and it was like beautiful and like crushed granite surface, and so it was just really integrated. And then while it was under construction, a hurricane came, and all those trees went, and so like they still went up. So now you're beautiful meandering things through nothing. Yeah, sometimes it'll throw a wrench at you.
Absolutely. That definitely has happened before, for sure. Anybody else have any experience, or does that process kind of similar to your classmate, or yeah, shaking your heads? Yes. Good. Pick up a pencil, draw. Do that.
Absolutely right.
Yes. That's something that I'm going to harp on a lot, probably. Just like pick up a pencil, start drawing. Like I know our ability, like we all like to think. We're thinkers. You're in school, that's what you're here. You're like, you're going to think. But also, if you're thinking, pick up that pencil, pen, marker, crayon, whatever, and just start drawing. That's one thing that I would definitely say hone in on. So what role should community engagement and citizen participation play in shaping neighborhood planning decisions, and how can it be enhanced?
So we go through this process a lot, and there's a lot of experience you can gain from this, and it's not always easy, right? You start asking for input. So I think what we found is that if you ask specific things at certain times in a project, how can the role of the community input phase be additive to the project and not a requirement that you just go in and you say, here's what I've drawn, what do you think? Or what do you guys want to see? Because they're going to talk about schools and traffic and just change, right? So when you go in with a specific agenda or topic, and you lead to, that's when you're going to get the most beneficial feedback, is kind of what we found.
Yeah, and make sure you have the right stakeholders at the table. One example I'll give that's it's more of a large scale rural planning project actually that we're working on, and it's identifying these seafood industry hubs. And really, we need the watermen to provide input. But if we put a public comment out, for people to provide comment, we're going to get a bunch of comments from kayakers and things that aren't necessarily relevant. This is a seafood industry.
I think it'd be beneficial.
Yeah. So having those right stakeholders and figuring out what is the best way to engage them, that's critically important in the success of neighborhood.
And it doesn't even have to be necessarily community engagement. It's just expert too, right? Just another outside opinion. So if you're designing something, go go to a school, go to a university, ask them your opinion. So it's just, as designers, we can always use additional perspectives. Sometimes when we're stuck on things, we just want to talk through it. Like, I'll just tell you what I'm doing just so I can hear myself go through it. And then hearing that other opinion or perspective is going to be really valuable. So that can be community or whoever, just bounce those ideas off people.
I would say that there's like a couple things that I would think about that community engagement can assist. So local knowledge, as we've already stated, ownership and resident buy-in, trusted development, and within the community, diverse perspectives is definitely key. And then you have to also think about inclusive representation. So if you're gonna have community engagement, you don't just want one sector of the community. You want to get as many people as you can. And the way to do that sometimes is obviously public meetings where, you're gonna get maybe any and everybody's gonna show up. And they're gonna show up and they're gonna talk about things that you probably didn't intend on them talking about. Like maybe you go to a community meeting and it's about trees. And a person shows up and they want to talk about NASA. This is an experience that absolutely happened at a public engagement meeting that I had. Haley was there. We went and we were there to talk about a tree manual. We were redesigning the city's tree manual. A lady had her 5 minutes. She came up and she spoke about NASA for 5 minutes. That was a public engagement meeting. The person showed up. They were there. They wanted to get their voices heard, but that's not why we were there. We were there to talk about trees. So just expect those kind of things to happen. It happens all the time. But you can also have focus groups where maybe you find those certain people where you're like, hey, you know what? This particular group, they need X, Y, and Z in this community. So I'm going to go specifically to them. I'm going to give them information and I want them to tell me what do they need in their space. And then you can also have one-on-one conversations as well as online platforms. I know surveys, everybody does surveys, but again, you get those crazy feedback that you didn't always ask for. So that's just something to take in and to think about when you are doing community engagement and you are involving people of different backgrounds. So what role do green spaces, parks, and urban green infrastructure play in sustainable neighborhood planning, and how can they be integrated effectively?
I think that's really speaks to some of what I was saying earlier about creating those opportunities for people to connect. And that really provides, place to create real community. Not just the physical community, but the mental is not the word I'm looking for, but you know what I mean.
Yep. What do you think, Sean?
I mean, it says what role. I mean, it is the role, right? Yeah. I mean, that open space, public space, and you can roll streetscape. All of those corridors contribute and engage and connect the community. And so our role is to create that value, because a lot of clients of ours just see that as a necessary check the box, but we have to help explain why the orchestration of those spaces is so important. And if you don't get that right, then that's a huge missed opportunity.
Yeah, and how can they be integrated effectively? It comes to mind as a good site analysis. If you don't understand your site and you just say, I want to do this because I think it looks cool, or because it's a cool idea, but it doesn't respond to the site, you're going to be in trouble pretty quickly.
Yeah. Do you guys think that when you are designing these green spaces, do you often create like design standards for those specific spaces, or are you allowing for that space to kind of take shape the way that it needs to? Do you overprogram it? Do you allow for the community to decide? Like, is there a mix? How do you guys typically do that?
At least in my practice, I think we're a little bit careful with getting too trendy, I guess, for lack of a better word, maybe, but and really trying to create places that are timeless. So from a material standpoint and that kind of thing. So that's someone answers that.
Yeah, and I think it depends on the scale, right? So when you're talking about community planning and like in the context of master plan communities, you're going to have an open space system. And I think looking through how that system performs, you can then start to establish a hierarchy of like, what's your heartbeat? And then what happens over here? How do you anchor and distribute spatially those experiences? And then how do they connect to each other? You can't do greatest park you've ever designed and then second greatest park you've ever designed. So just think through and leave some for the next one. Just have that hierarchy there.
Yes, that is absolutely true. I definitely think that one way to incorporate green spaces and parks and open spaces in urban places is to think about what is the maintenance and activation. That's something that might be at the back of our minds. So when we are designing these green spaces, oftentimes myself, I think about who's maintaining it. Is it going to be the city? Is it going to be the private developers? Because a lot of times, like you said, you create that phenomenal one park, and then the other park is almost good, and then your third park is just like a paseo, or like it's just some trees. But is that same park that you designed going to be maintained at the level that you designed it? Because that is oftentimes where a landscape architect's heart is broken. Is you go out 4 or 5 years later and you're like, oh man,
What could have been?
what could have been if they just had a maintenance budget that was great, or something that we talked about. Because one thing that I'm actually working on right now is I have to create a maintenance booklet for a development that I'm working on, and it is hard because they told me that they are a cut and blow kind of maintenance. So I said that then tells me what I need to put in to that design and how I need to configure everything, because I was going to go in with beautiful grasses, landscape, and if they're only going to cut it and blow it, I'm putting St. Augustine grass and some Bahia. I'm not going to put too much effort in because it's not going to be maintained. So when you are designing these green spaces and parks and space, think about what that maintenance is going to be like, and even try to have the conversation with the client or the people that are going to be there, because sometimes it could be that the community may want to take ownership of that space. Are they going to maintain it? Who's going to do that? So that's something to think about as well when you're doing these.
So that's a really good point.
Yeah, and just to expand on that a little bit, when you talk about parks and open space, specifically, and I think a little bit differently than master plan communities where one developer or entity would own most of that stuff. When you go into public parks, there's always an issue of ownership and maintenance, liability, and all that stuff. So in my mind, I always roll my eyes. It's like, how much maintenance and liability is there in most parks, right? Because typically they're kind of green spaces, not overly programmed, not overly manicured. But it's really important, like Shima said, your contractors can be so important because they're going to make you look good. I've had some really bad contractors that made some really good designs look not so great. And then the maintenance expectation, because like she was saying, not everything can be manicured golf course. You got to think through, what's this going to look like when it's a little bit overgrown? How easy is it to kind of keep meeting the objectives for what you designed?
Great point. In what ways can technology and data-driven insights enhance the decision-making process in urban planning for neighborhoods and communities? What do you guys think? This is a tough.
It is. I mean, you talk about trends. I think data and technology, AI, all that stuff is starting to make its way, not just in how we design, but how the places are being used. And you're talking about automation of getting there to what you're doing while you're there. I mean, some examples that we're seeing kind of early on in this, because again, it's still being tested, so aren't a lot of great examples, but there's fountains that people can control with their phone, right? They're interactive. They can engage with things in a different way than traditionally you couldn't. But I think that's going to increasingly become important, is the data and technology aspect.
Yeah, keeping up with the software and the technology is a challenge. But one of the cool, I think, softwares that we've used is actually tracking people or what people do compared to like a vehicle. Like there's traffic impact analysis, and you can anticipate what cars are going to do. But what about people? So there's some softwares that we've worked with architects on actually to anticipate where people might go. How and that informs your design. Really, it's part of the process, and that's I think a technology that's out there that maybe can be used more.
Have you used Placer? Have you guys used Placer? Anybody heard of Placer? So I didn't know anything about this until last week. I was at a meeting for a district that we're designing, and they were talking about this after 5, symphony party that they're having in South Park in Charlotte. And Placer is a technology subscribe and get data, so they know exactly how many people attended their event, where these people went afterwards. So it's anonymous, right? So they don't know that Shima went from here to PK's and then to down the stairs and then home. But what it does say is, like, of the 87% of people that were here of this age, 48% went to dinner and then went to this place. So like, not being creepy, but just to know like what you're designing to. That blew my mind. That is
like a QR code or something you scanned on the way in, or how'd that work?
Probably. Again, I was just I fell out of my chair, so I was like trying to get myself, but But they had a lot of data that I didn't know was
possible.
was there.
It's just-
Again, it was anonymous, so
Still, it's not.
that's what they say.
So I know that like when we're in school, everybody's gonna learn GIS. So GIS mapping is one way that we kind of use data. Like we don't necessarily like so at Kinley Horn we have a GIS department. So if there's information or something that I want to know about a specific project, I'll oftentimes go to our experts in GIS because yes, you're gonna learn how to use it, and yes, hopefully you can do some mapping and do all those things. But there are gonna be people that are well beyond your expertise, and I sometimes go to them and I ask them questions about like what is the crime rate in this area, like what is the density population like what are these specific things that I need to know, and by using their software that they created, they can then spit out information to me that I can then apply to a map. I can then tell my client like, hey, maybe you don't want to develop in this area because of what's going on here. So GIS mapping is one way, but also we have a couple projects in the community in Orlando called Lake Nona, and they're trying to make it into like a smart city. So smart cities is definitely something that like we're looking at, but I know that technology is well beyond me, but I know that it kind of allows for people kind of like what you said to have data that allows for them, the client, you to know what should go in this space. Should we really make it a parks and open space, or should it be focused on mixed use development? So it kind of allows you to tailor what your design is based on the data that you're getting from people who are willingly giving it, not taking it,
If you're designing based on information, then that's going to help your foundation. Yes, good question in the back.
Do you feel that the more we lean towards technology and data, the less community engagement we'll need to do because now you have data?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think that so data is kind of like community engagement you're always going to have because there are always going to be those people that want to show up and tell you right in your face, this is what we're doing. We don't like what you're doing. This is what we need. Data is going to help us get those people that don't show up. The people that are 18 to 35 that may just want to use their phone because they're like, I don't have time to go to community engagement meetings. Because a lot of time those meetings are at times where you're still at work, you can't necessarily go. So data gives us the opportunity to gather all the information instead of only getting it from a select group of people. So I think going in that direction not only helps us as designers, but it helps the overall process fully. Because if we only stick to data, then it's anonymous. We don't really know if those people even live in that space or if they're giving valuable information. But then if we only stick to community engagement, we're only going to get those people that show up. So having both, I think genuinely is best.
Yeah, data is like the inventory. It's not the analysis or the synthesis of that data. It's just telling you this is happening and that's it. But why? That's up to us to figure out and engage with those people on the ground to talk about it.
Yeah, it should be more aggregate. You should be using that with the community, response. Because when you collect the data, you're getting stuff and it's all the same tone and it's all the same priority. But when you go look at people, then they can stand on their chairs and tell you what's most important. A little different than, the one line that shows up on the survey. Yes.
So in terms of site analysis, what data do you see most consistently always showing up in like urban planning? In terms of like creating space for like communities and stuff like that, like what site analysis element always ends up in your?
There's things like walk sheds, like how close, what are the walking distances to things, like amenities, grocery stores, those kind of living amenities that people need, necessities.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a starting point with it. We're doing a planning exercise now. We're looking at an entire district that's 2 or 3 square miles. And the data has helped us create heat maps that, again, it isn't telling anybody anything new. We're just giving them more meat behind it and facts and data. So that it gives us a stronger foundation when we make recommendations. And those heat maps are land use intensities, walkability, the walk sheds, transit, open spaces, greenway access. I mean, all that stuff. When you can map that and show it when you're a visual person like me, then that just helps you be able to talk through and like communicate that better.
Yeah, I think that those are definitely the things that I see the most. And I think in Florida, a lot of times it's a lot of people want to know how can they interact with water better because we have obviously a lot of ponds, streams, lakes. So people are trying to figure out. And well, we have alligators and
Not good to
crocodiles.
engage water.
We have crocodiles too now. So yeah, people are trying to figure out how do they engage with water in a safe way. So that's something that we always see, and that's something that we take into account anytime that we're designing spaces near water and actually even not even necessarily water, we're thinking about stormwater. That's one of the biggest things because as we know, climate change, all those things are happening. Oftentimes we're trying to figure out how can we mitigate for runoff that's coming off our site? How is it going to impact people downstream? Or how is what we're doing going to, help with things that are going on with like red tide in Tampa or things of that nature. So water is definitely a big one that we see a lot.
And if you can amenitize or create value out of something that's necessary, like stormwater or any of the infrastructure related things, that's going to be your huge opportunity because it's going to be required anyway.
Another topic on that note, before you change it, I think is VR and where that's kind of going. Helping people understand. I think not more often, but oftentimes something gets built and everyone's like, that's not what I thought it was going to look like. So I think that there is a space for VR, and I think we're as an industry trying to figure out how to use it most effectively. So that's something that's still a good point.
Has there ever been a time when like you've talked to the community, but then you've looked at the data and they're almost like different, like where it's just,
something's wrong, the data's wrong, and the
yeah, like where it's you're just kind of like, what's like, how did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a matter of prioritization.
Yeah,
it's a tough one though. What do you do, right? So you start to
You ask why.
strip it down, right? And I don't think any of them's wrong, but you just kind of have to peel it back a little bit and understand kind of what's going into it. That's a great question.
I would expand out from that one a little bit though, and this is not something I just kind of magically thought up, but it's Matt Powers, our school director, was talking about this yesterday. Data is facts. But most of the things that we do are not fact-based, they're experientially based. And so, yes, the fact is that, be willing to walk a quarter of a mile. But if it's not a nice walk, that's experience, right? That's not data. I'm not making that walk. And so I think a lot of what you do is so much informed by how you present experience, that using the data as a way of informing the decision process, but it's not the only thing you use.
Yeah. No, that's a great point.
And application of that data, absolutely important.
What innovative design and architecture approaches have you seen that can enhance the sustainability of urban neighborhoods while fostering a sense of community?
I think like Sean said, amenitizing some of the infrastructure that's like necessary, like such as stormwater.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really cool things you can do with stormwater. It doesn't have to be an ugly pond in the corner.
Yeah. I think for us, it's we do a lot of rooftop gardens, terraces. We do green infrastructure and blue infrastructure. We definitely look at stormwater, trying to amenitize those. And we try to work with our architecture partners in the best way possible to figure out if they're going for, let's say, LEED or LEED Platinum, then our landscape needs to adhere to that as well. And so we work in tandem with them. And that's kind of a plug for you guys to talk to your architecture friends here on campus, start to talk to them, communicate with them, figure out how they're designed. What are the materials that they're using? What are they looking at? So that also helps you to figure out, okay, if they're going this way, I should probably follow, or I should talk to them about, hey, this is what we're doing. What are you guys doing? So don't just design on an island. You design as a collective group with interior, industrial, architecture, and because you're all going to work together at some point in your career.
Yeah, I think innovation allows us more broad design abilities. So we'll have some projects that will be built upon a theme, whether it's a natural theme or something that's historic. And I think using innovation to reconnect with that theme is going to allow you to tell that story better. And whether or not you tell that story with wayfinding and signage and things like that, or materiality, that innovation can be applied to help tell that story. And that then resonates with the audience, and it doesn't die with the documents where we just say, oh, this is cool because I had this little secret sauce on this project. And then once it was built, no one ever knows about it. It just lives in your drawings.
Yeah, I think something as simple too as like the chalk wall in Charlottesville is an example of really, that's just a chalkboard, in a plaza, but there's a sense of community around that people feel like they can voice their opinion, or they want to write, I love my mom or whatever on it, and it's really simple. So you don't really have to overthink
I'll share one more real quick thing about innovation. So when we had the lunch before this, I shared quickly about a project that we're currently working on, actually in Saudi Arabia. It's a civic arena over there. And so HKS is the architect on it. And you talk about innovation, the idea behind this arena is that it emerged from the rocks. So the facade of it is very rocky. It is very, of the earth, it's wild. And then at the top of the arena is a waterfall that spills down into this public plaza. And it's like just this burst of energy, except they don't have a lot of water in Saudi Arabia. So it's all done with lights. So lights create that effect and it's just continuous. And then that creates the energy for the public plaza. And it's brilliant. It is wild. And so that just creates community and really kind of celebrates that idea. So how do you utilize those things in a cost-effective way? It takes Saudi Arabia money to be able to do lighting like that, but at that scale, but it's pretty wild.
What lessons can be learned from global best practices in neighborhood planning that have achieved outstanding outcomes? Let's think.
I think the classic example is Central Park in New York City. And just thinking about, the real estate around Central Park and how it's shaped by Central Park, how it's used, how it's the value of that real estate. That's sort of the classic example, I guess.
I mean, even think about the High Line. The High
That's a
Line
great example.
being added in, that was a railroad, and now it's all the real estate around that is insane because a landscape architect decided that they were gonna revitalize that and make it a space that everybody wants to go to. And I'm sure everybody has obviously studied the High Line. So looking at that is definitely something that is a lesson learned. So what if you design it and you design it well and you design it in the space, Charlotte is a prime example of real estate in what Noda has boomed because of the designs of people like us.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about global best practices, before I start thinking globally, I want to think regionally, right? And so we have several offices, one of which is in Boulder. And one of the things that we always talk about a lot when we do talk to the partners in Boulder are water rights. And that's a very, very important thing right now in the West, the free range frontier. And the water rights, just because we don't have to deal with it right now, we should be thinking through that stuff because that's kind of on our doorstep. So thinking through those practices and how we can start to find their way into the projects we do right now are just going to be beneficial and kind of help achieve that sustainability, even though that may just be our idea and not something that the client has to invest in.
Have you studied anything recently that we may not be aware of? Because, trends are continuing to emerge. Has there been anything that you guys have seen in your studies that you think is a global best practice that you are going to be incorporating in your designs going forward? Outside of, mixed use, walkability, the typical things that we see.
That's a tough one. It's gonna be a lot of crazy hands.
What do you think?
I saw, this was a while ago, it might have been a West 8 project. It was like a parking garage that was underground. And so it was like turfed along the top and kind of like a natural landform aesthetic. And then you go under to park. I just thought that was cool. It's like, I wish all parking garages could be underground.
Yeah, that's probably super expensive. I can't imagine structural on that one, but
Creative reuse of land. No one's making any more land.
No.
So, how we can be creative and innovative in how we use land is definitely something that we need to consider.
Yeah. So I would say if you haven't seen anything, start to look on ASLA is a good resource, but if you're thinking about more globally and looking at things from like planning and a neighborhood community landscape architecture perspective, look at ULI. They have a lot of innovative things that are online, and that's a great resource for everybody to use. ASLA is great, but if you're thinking about global things, ULI is a great plug for anybody to kind of go out there, research, kind of understand exactly what's going on outside of this region of Southwest Virginia. So we got 2 more questions, and then we'll open it up for any questions that you guys have. What emerging trends and innovations do you foresee in the field of neighborhood and community planning?
Affordable housing is one we mentioned earlier that is going to be a tough one as we move forward. I think as you provide nice amenities and the value goes up, then all of a sudden houses aren't affordable. So how do we achieve that balance there? Is a question that I think we struggle with.
Yeah, I think affordable housing certainly is a big one. I know in Charlotte, we talk about that every day. Also just kind of authenticity of place and how can we help connect people to projects is always going to be a trend. And I think now, at least in my career, more so than ever, I think people are seeing the importance of place and from a market standpoint, investing in things that are community benefits, not just because it's a requirement or the right thing to do or whatever, but because there's a market that desires that. And I think that's a big wave we can ride.
I think that those are definitely two things that I've seen. I think so. I had 6 trends that I've kind of noticed, and I found these through research and just talking to some of my senior practitioners in the office. We think about in Florida aging in place. So a lot of times we're seeing a lot of developments that are 55 plus neighborhood communities, and that's not necessarily something that's new. But the way that we design those spaces, we aren't giving them a different design than what we would do for a typical community. We're looking at it as, okay, if you're going to age in place, what does that look like? Do you still want to have amenities? Yes. Do you still want to have walkability? Do you still want to have all these things that another neighborhood down the street that's not 55 plus has? So that's one thing that we're definitely focused on. We're looking also at resilience and climate adaptation. So those of you who are 5th years, who are in Mente's studio, Virginia Beach, climate change. He talked about that when I was in school. That's still a thing. So sea level is rising. So that's something that we definitely think about and how can we design. And Stephen's project is definitely a prime example of that. But then something that actually is super important is multimodal transportation. So Charlotte is a great example of having the light rail and the tram system. We're trying to do similar things in Orlando and all in the South region as well. But what does that look like? How do you develop a community off of a trail line? Is everything or off of a tram line? How does that happen? But then also thinking about local food systems. So thinking about what does it look like if you're designing a community, but then where's the closest grocery store? Where's the closest farmer's market? What does that look like? How do you develop those communities and those systems to be in place for your overall development? So those are some things that we definitely look at. And I know for myself, I'm definitely focused on the multimodal transportation.
Yeah, certainly bike and ped is a big piece of that, and we're seeing that all over the place. Every project we touch has a bike and ped going into it.
Yeah, and to touch on the coastal resiliency one more time as well, there's a lot of federal money that's coming down from the federal government in the form of grants that are going to towns and cities, counties to address some of those issues. And that's really an emerging trend that we're seeing. There's all kinds of money out there to address resiliency.
So the last question that we have is looking ahead, what do you see as future challenges and opportunities in neighborhood planning, and how can we prepare for them?
I think going back to the scale that we're talking about today, where it's the larger kind of greenfields. Stephen said land, they don't make more land. So our resources, our canvas on which we design is different now than it was 20 years ago. So the way that we evolve and start to create community when we don't have a blank slate, right? I think that's going to be a big challenge. Some way that we can evolve in how we design and communicate, community and those community principles.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities in the way that people live their lives. A lot of people wake up and get in a car and drive for 45 minutes to somewhere, and then they work, and then they drive 45 minutes back, and they don't really have a community other than I guess their office that they go to. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to create community and outside of the downtowns as well, where a lot of people are living.
And how do you keep that affordable?
That's a challenge and an opportunity.
I would say some of the challenges that we've identified are looking at urban density and green spaces. So those, as we stated, land isn't going to go anywhere. Biodiversity and conservation, housing affordability is huge, but also rapid urbanization. So there's this push to continue to develop. We have clients that want to take up every possible land that there is, and they want to develop as many houses, and they want to squeeze them on there as tightly as they possibly can. That is something that is a huge challenge for landscape architects, and working with our civil and architecture partners is realizing that when those developments do happen, talking to them beforehand when they're doing their site planning and saying, hey, we can help you with this. How about you don't leave me a half an acre tract in this 500 development, and you actually allow for me to help you in your planning. We can create a space and a community within this development that's privately held. So that's something that we definitely are dealing with, I'm sure, all over the region, but very specifically in Central Florida. Every development now, we work with our civil partners and we try to figure out how can we as landscape architects develop a community, in a community that's already going to be a bunch of homes. A bunch of opportunities that we can look at are health and wellness. So green spaces and open spaces, sustainable transportation, as well as continuing to focus on community-driven planning. So not forgetting the people that you are going to be designing for. Trying your best to engage them at the beginning, middle, and end of the project is something that is a great opportunity. You can continue to do that, and you can definitely hone your skills while you're in school and definitely once you're out. So any questions you guys have? That's the end of our lecture today.